Imagine a book written right in the thick of World War II, yeah? And it just instantly sets off fireworks.
Right.
What on earth pushed Hayek, an economist, to write such a, well, political book during a massive war?
It's a great question. And what's fascinating here is that Hayek, a professional economist, felt this peculiar and serious duty, his words, to write this political book from about 1940 to 43.
A duty, strong word.
It was. He was really annoyed, actually, by what he saw as a complete misinterpretation over in England in progressive circles about what the Nazi movement actually was.
How so? Misinterpretation in what way?
Well, he didn't see it as some kind of capitalist reaction against socialism. He saw it as the necessary outcome of those same socialist tendencies, central planning tendencies.
Wow, okay. That's a provocative take right there.
Definitely. And he also pointed out, that lots of economists who might have pushed back were busy with the war effort.
Right, absorbed by the war machine, as he put it.
Exactly. And silenced by official jobs. So public discussion was left to, well, amateurs and cranks. His words again, maybe a bit harsh, but that was his feeling.
Okay, so that context is crucial, but then the dedication to the socialists of all parties. That just sounds backward, like poking the bear.
It does sound counterintuitive, doesn't it? But it raises this really important question. Why do that?
Yeah, what was the thinking?
Hayek spelled it out. He said, basically, socialism can be put into practice only by methods which most socialists disapprove. That's the key.
Okay, so he's saying their goals are fine, maybe, but the way to get there...
Precisely. He thought the old socialist parties were held back by their democratic beliefs.
Too nice, almost.
In a way, yeah. He felt they did not possess the ruthlessness required to actually implement full-blown central planning. So the dedication was a warning, like, look where your ideas could actually lead, even if you don't intend it.
Oh, warning about unintended consequences. Got it. Okay, so let's trace Hayek's core argument. He talks about Western civilization being on this specific path, an abandoned road, he called it. What was that road?
Right, connecting this to the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Hayek argued that Western civilization, going back to Christianity, classical times, was fundamentally individualist.
Individualist how? What did that look like?
Well, key things were like respect for the individual man, qua man, as a man himself, recognizing his own views, his tastes as supreme in his own sphere, and fostering, the development of individual gifts, individual talent. He saw this leading to incredible things, this marvelous growth of science, amazing material progress, stuff beyond man's wildest dreams. That was the road.
The road based on individual freedom and discovery, and then something changed, a turn.
Exactly. Around the turn of the 20th century, he saw this growing impatience. Liberalism seemed too slow.
People took the progress for granted.
Yet what had been achieved was seen as like a secure and imperishable possession. Done deal. So the focus shifted, not just tweaking the system, but a complete remodeling of society.
And that led to
what he called the Great Utopia, the big promise of socialism.
Okay, here's where it gets really, really interesting for me. Hayek said this new idea of freedom they were selling was actually a dangerous illusion. How did he argue that?
This is so crucial to his whole argument. He saw the word freedom itself getting perverted, twisted.
How so?
Historically, freedom meant freedom from coercion, freedom from someone else's arbitrary power telling you what to do. Negative liberty, basically.
Right. Freedom from interference.
But this new definition started popping up.
Right.
Freedom from necessity. Freedom from, the compulsion of the circumstances. Needing a job, lacking wealth.
That sounds good, though. Freedom from hardship.
It sounds appealing, absolutely. But Hayek said, hang on, that's merely another name for power or wealth. It changes freedom from being about absence of constraint to being about the presence of capacity or stuff.
Ah, I see the shift.
And he argued socialists kind of exploited this common word freedom, promising more freedom in this new sense, but it blinded people to the clash between socialism's methods, central control, and real traditional liberalism.
So using the same word for two very different concepts.
Exactly, leading people down a path they didn't fully understand.
And then he connects this to totalitarianism. He claimed communism and fascism were just variants of the same totalitarianism. That's a huge claim, still is.
Oh, absolutely huge. And deeply controversial, especially then. But Hayek felt it became almost obvious, a commonplace, he said after his book came out,
Obvious how.
that fascism and communism are merely variants of the same totalitarianism which central control of all economic activity tends to produce. That was his core linkage. The method leads to the outcome, regardless of the initial label.
Did he have examples? People who saw this?
He did. He pointed to people like Max Eastman, who had been a friend of Lenin's, mind you, who eventually concluded Stalinism is worse than fascism, and importantly, Stalinism is socialism.
Wow, from Lenin's friend.
Yeah. And others, like W.H. Chamberlain, a journalist who'd seen Soviet Russia up close, warned that socialism is certain to prove the road not to freedom, but to dictatorship.
So, not just theory for him.
Not at all. He'd point out that many leaders, from Mussolini downward, started out as socialists. They didn't see it as a contradiction to end up as fascists or Nazis. He saw a disturbing thread connecting them.
That connection is uncomfortable for many, I imagine.
Deeply uncomfortable. It challenges the whole left-right spectrum as people usually thought of it then and often still do.
Okay, so if the methods are the problem, not necessarily the initial good intentions, what did Hayek actually mean by planning in that dangerous sense? He wasn't against all planning, surely.
No, not at all. He was very clear on this. He wasn't against individuals planning their lives or businesses planning. He wasn't even against the state planning certain infrastructure like roads or setting basic rules.
So what was the target?
What he opposed was very specific. A central direction of all economic activity according to a single plan. One blueprint, basically. Laying down how all of society's resources should be consciously directed to achieve specific goals in a specific way.
Right, the top-down, comprehensive kind.
Exactly. The debate, he said, isn't whether we should use foresight, but about what is the best way of so doing. Central command, or decentralized individuals within a rule of law. That's the choice.
And what did he see as the main consequences of that kind of central, comprehensive planning?
Well, this is where it gets really profound. He quoted Hilaire Belloc, actually, saying, "The control of the production of wealth is the control of human life itself."
Control of wealth is control of life. How?
Because, Hayek argued, there aren't really any purely economic ends.
Yeah.
Everything we want, everything we strive for, needs resources, needs means.
Okay.
And money, he said, is actually one of the greatest instruments of freedom ever invented. Why? Because it gives you choice. You decide what ends to pursue with it.
Right, it's neutral. It lets you pick your goals.
Exactly. But when planners control all economic activity, they control the means for all our ends. They aren't just directing resources, they're deciding which values get prioritized, which goals are worthy. They're effectively determining what men should believe and strive for.
Wow, so economic control becomes moral control.
That's the heart of it. It's not just about efficiency. It's about who gets to decide what matters in life.
And that would strip away personal choice, even in seemingly small things, like your job.
Absolutely. He said promises of free choice of occupation under such a system become purely fictitious.
Why fictitious?
Because the planners have to control who goes into which jobs, right? They need certain numbers of engineers, farmers, whatever the plan demands. So they have to control the entry into the different trades and occupations or the terms of remuneration or both. Wages, assignments.
Yeah.
It can't be truly free choice if the plan dictates the needs.
That makes sense. The plan's needs override individual desires.
Right. And this connects to inequality, too. He argued that inequality that results from, impersonal market forces, luck, skill, whatever, is much more readily born, psychologically.
For you to swallow, maybe.
Yeah, than suffering or inequality that feels deliberately imposed by authority. When you feel worse off because some official decided it, because some authority wills it, that breeds resentment.
Because it feels personal, directed.
Exactly. And this, Hayek said, leads straight to Lenin's famous chilling question. Who? Whom? Who plans whom? Who directs and dominates whom? That becomes the central political fight, not just about policy, but about power over lives.
You mentioned earlier he had this section on why the worst get on top in these systems. How did he explain that? It sounds quite cynical.
It does sound cynical, but he was trying to analyze the political logic. It raises this big question about the moral consequences of collectivism. He gave three main reasons why the kind of large unified group you need to enforce a single plan. Well, it's not likely to be formed by the best, but rather by the worst elements of society.
Okay, what were the reasons?
First, he said it's just easier to get people to agree on hating something or someone, a negative program. hatred of an enemy, envy of the rich or successful. That's a powerful unifier, unfortunately.
Negative cohesion. Easier than agreeing on positive goals.
Right. Second, it tends to appeal more to the docile and gullible, people who don't have strong convictions of their own and are happy to accept a ready-made value system if it's, drummed into their ears sufficiently loudly.
Those looking for simple answers, maybe.
Perhaps. And third, he thought that strong group identification often comes from a feeling of inferiority. Being part of a powerful group gives you a sense of superiority over outsiders, which satisfies that feeling. He quoted Reinhold Niebuhr on this, about the increasing tendency among modern men to imagine themselves ethical because they have delegated their vices to larger and larger groups, letting the group be ruthless so the individual feels clean.
That's quite a sobering psychological analysis.
It really is a stark warning about group dynamics under centralized power.
And all this, he argued, leads to the end of truth. That sounds incredibly bleak.
It's one of his most profound warnings, I think. For a totalitarian system, a centrally planned system, to really work, people have to buy into it. They have to believe the plan's goals are their own goals.
Right, you need compliance, belief.
So this requires official doctrines, constant propaganda, constant justification for the plan and its outcomes. And this inevitably undermines one of the foundations of all morals, the sense of and the respect for truth.
How does it undermine truth?
Well, one key technique he identified is using the old familiar words but completely changing their meaning. We talked about liberty earlier.
Yeah, redefining it.
Exactly, redefining it as collective freedom or freedom from necessity. This complete perversion of language, as he called it, just creates confusion. It makes rational debate impossible because you're not even using words the same way anymore.
Talking past each other.
Completely.
Yeah.
And ultimately, this leads to a stagnation of thought and a decline of reason. People stop questioning, stop thinking critically. The terrible paradox, Hayek points out, is that collectivism often starts out to make reason supreme, planning everything rationally. But it ends by destroying reason itself.
Wow. Starts with rational planning, ends by killing reason. That's quite the arc.
It is a very grim potential trajectory he outlined.
Now, Hayek also looked at history, didn't he? He drew some strong lines between intellectual trends in Germany and the rise of totalitarianism there. Can you expand on that connection he made?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
He spent quite a bit of time showing how the link between socialism and nationalism was actually close from the beginning in Germany, much closer than people often thought.
Who were the key figures he mentioned?
Well, people like Werner Sombart, Johann Plinsch, influential thinkers who explicitly pushed for an ideal of organization over the older ideal of freedom. They saw organization, state control, as the very essence of socialism.
Organization over freedom.
Right. And they even interpreted World War I in these terms. They saw it as a clash between the ideas of 1789, liberty, equality, fraternity from the French Revolution.
Individual liberty, basically.
Exactly. Versus the ideas of 1914, the German idea of organization, duty, the collective, the state. They saw Germany as the exemplary people destined to lead the world into this new, highly organized, state-run future. A Beamtenstaat. He called it a state where basically everyone is a public official.
A nation as one big bureaucracy.
That was the vision he was tracing back.
That's a really strong historical thread he's pulling there. But crucially, he also insisted he wasn't saying any of this was inevitable, right? That seems like a point that could easily get lost.
Oh, absolutely. And he got quite upset about it. He strongly resented the false allegation, as he termed it, that he was arguing each step away from the market system is inevitably a journey that must end in a totalitarian state.
So he wasn't predicting doom with every regulation.
No. He explicitly said, nor am I arguing that these developments are inevitable. If they were, there would be no point in writing this. His book wasn't a prophecy, it was a warning.
A warning about what, specifically?
A warning that we need to be careful, that we should insist that any modification in our arrangements should pass certain tests, basically, before we commit, especially to paths from which withdrawal may be difficult. It was about critical thinking, about understanding the potential slippery slope, not saying we were already sliding down it uncontrollably.
Okay, that distinction is vital. So, bringing this forward, for you, the listener, what does this historical view, these warnings, mean for us today? How is it relevant now?
Well, one direct application Hayek stressed was to be wary of such martial invocations, war metaphors.
Like the war on poverty or war on terror?
Exactly. Things like the war on drugs. He argued these phrases allow leaders to ask for sacrifices and expand state power dramatically, often without clear goals or end dates. It creates a kind of permanent emergency footing.
Right, because in a war, normal rules get suspended.
Precisely. He also warned against chasing single overarching goals like full employment at any price. Because, he argued, individual freedom cannot be reconciled with the supremacy of one single purpose, imposed from the top down. Life is about balancing multiple, often competing, values.
Not sacrificing everything for one metric.
Right. And, we did see a kind of tragic, controlled scientific experiment, as some have called it, with East and West Germany.
The split after the war.
Yeah. You had people of the same blood, the same civilization, torn asunder, adopting radically different economic and political systems. And the results, tyranny and misery on one side, freedom and affluence on the other, broadly speaking. Hayek saw that as a real-world validation of his core arguments.
A stark contrast, definitely. He even took this up to the international level, didn't he? Thinking about planning between nations.
He did, yeah. If we broaden the scope, Hayek warned that national economic planning, where each country tries to control its own economy centrally, inevitably creates friction between countries. Barriers to trade, restrictions on movement.
Economic nationalism, basically.
Exactly. But then he said the idea of international planning, some global body trying to plan the world economy, is even more dangerous.
More dangerous than national planning. Why?
Because it risks becoming a naked rule of force. A small group imposing its standards, its values, its plan on everyone else, with no real democratic accountability on that scale. Who gets to decide the global plan?
Right. The who-whom question writ large.
Precisely. His alternative was a federal principle, applied internationally. A supranational authority, yes, but with strictly limited, strictly circumscribed powers. Focused on maintaining the rule of law between nations, creating a community of nations of free men, not a global command structure.
Fascinating. So rule of law, not rule by plan, even internationally. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. As we wrap up this deep dive into the road to serfdom, what really stands out to you? We've hit his big warnings about central planning, the erosion of freedom, truth decaying, how good intentions might pave that road. It's heavy stuff.
It is heavy, but incredibly thought-provoking. For me, the absolute core lesson is understanding that fundamental choice he lays out. Do we rely on a system that gives the knowledge and initiative of individuals the best scope within clear, known rules? Spontaneous order, basically. Versus giving in to the temptation of central direction and organization of all our activities according to some consciously constructed blueprint. He was utterly convinced that second path, no matter how well-meaning the planners are, inevitably leads away from liberty as he understood it. That's the stark choice he presents.
Okay, so a final thought for everyone listening. Consider this. Hayek suggests that maybe the most important change which extensive government control produces is a psychological change, an alteration in the character of the people.
A change within us.
Yeah, if that's true, how vigilant do we need to be? Not just about specific policies, but about how the systems around us might be subtly changing us. Changing our values, our assumptions about what's normal, what's acceptable, what deeply held beliefs might you unknowingly be trading away, perhaps for a different, maybe easier, but ultimately less meaningful kind of freedom.